In 1937, the sheriff of Ozark County, Missouri, still used a horse, not because he could not afford a car, because the roads were so rough and the creek crossings so numerous that a man on horseback could get to where he was going faster than anyone behind a steering wheel. The hills had not been tamed yet. The infrastructure had not arrived. The Ozarks in 1937 was still, in most of its interior, a place that moved at the speed of a horse. In Marion County, Arkansas, the mail was still being delivered on horseback into the 1950s. A mounted postman there recalled this, and a researcher who interviewed him documented that he delivered a mail-order cook stove to a family one piece at a time because the packages were too large to carry all at once, and the road between the post office and the family's hollow was too rough for anything with wheels. The cook stove arrived one piece at a time over an extended period, and the family was glad to get it. The first paved road in Stone County, Arkansas was not until 1957. This was the Ozarks that existed before the buyers arrived, before the investment funds, the timber companies, the private equity structures, and the foreign-linked entities that this channel has been covering for months. Before any of that, there was a specific and functional world in these hills that operated on its own terms, at its own pace, largely outside the cash economy that governed the rest of America, and largely invisible to the people in St. Louis and Kansas City and New York who would eventually decide they wanted what was here. That world is gone, and the buyers are why it is gone. But the story is more complicated than that, because the buyers who destroyed it first were not the ones you have been watching on this channel. They came a century earlier, and understanding what they did is the only way to understand what is being finished right now. Subscribe right now. Hit the button and the bell. Before 1931, the area that is now the Lake of the Ozarks was river bottoms and rolling hills in Benton, Camden, Morgan, and Miller counties. Small communities of German, Scotch-Irish, and indigenous descent homesteaders had farmed the Osage River Valley for generations. They grew what they ate, traded what they grew, and lived largely without cash in a functional economy that outsiders consistently described as poverty because it did not look like anything they recognized as prosperity. They were not poor in the ways that mattered to them. They had land they owned outright. They had springs that ran clean and cold year-round. They had rivers full of fish. They had forests they hunted in. They had the specific self-sufficiency of people who had figured out over several generations exactly what this particular landscape required of them and what it would give back. Two Kansas City businessmen, a man named Ralph Street and a man named Leighton Cravens, decided in the late 1920s that the Osage River was worth more as a reservoir than as a valley where people lived. They created the Missouri Hydroelectric Power Company. They arranged deals with Union Electric in St. Louis. They sent surveyors and real estate agents into the valley with offers to trade the Ozarks family's flood-prone bottomland for farmable land elsewhere. Many families did not understand what was being proposed. Many did not believe the dam would hold water. Some did not believe their land would actually be affected. Cravens was later indicted for misappropriation of land bank funds and sent to prison. The project continued without him. In 1929, construction on Bagnell Dam began. More than 20,000 workers arrived, earning 35 cents an hour. In February 1931, the water began to rise. Old Lynn Creek, the county seat of Camden County, with its courthouse, its churches, and its families who had been there for generations, went under. The towns along the Osage River Valley followed. By the time the lake was officially open on May 30th, 1931, 1,150 miles of new shoreline had been created, and an unknown number of communities, homesteads, cemeteries, and family farms were at the bottom of it. That was the first time someone decided the Ozarks was worth more transformed than it was intact. Hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this story matters. The Ozarks that remained after the lake was built held on to itself longer than most places in America managed to. In 1930, the only towns in the Missouri Ozarks with more than 2,500 residents were the mining towns Bonne Terre, Carthage, Webb City, and Joplin, and the administrative centers. The interior of the Ozarks, the deep parts, the Shannon County hollows, the Douglas County ridges, and the Taney County Creek valleys were places where a person could go an entire week without seeing anyone they did not already know. The Ozarks float trip in its original form was not a tourism product. It was a transaction between two people who both knew the river, a knowledgeable guide, someone who knew every gravel bar and every riffle and every deep pool on the Current or the Jack's Fork, would take a party of fishermen down the river for a few days. The fishermen caught fish, the guide got paid. The payment was often not money. The documentation of this economy describes guides trading a creel full of fish for a fistful of dollars, sometimes for goods, or sometimes for a debt that would be settled later in some other form. The river itself was the asset. The knowledge of it was the currency. The ginseng economy worked the same way. Families in the deep Ozarks hollows, the places with no paved road and no reliable access, the places where the mail came by horse, foraged ginseng from the forest floor and sold it to buyers who came through on established routes. Ginseng root brought real money, the kind of money that a subsistence farm could not generate from crops, and it grew wild in the Ozarks forests in quantities that made the foraging worthwhile if you knew where to look. Which families did. They had been looking in the same places for generations. The knowledge of where the ginseng grew was passed from parents to children, the same way the knowledge of which springs ran in dry summers was passed down as practical inheritance, worth more than a deed. Morel mushrooms, wild persimmons, pawpaw from the creek bottoms, watercress from the springs, blackberries from the ridge edges. The Ozarks. Foraging economy was not a romantic idea about living close to nature. It was a specific, functional, well-organized system that sustained families in places where no other economy could reach them. As late as the 1960s, researchers described the Ozarks as constituting a discrete cultural province, a specific and coherent world with its own folkways, its own dialect, its own relationship to the land, distinct from anything outside it. Not backward, not isolated in the sense of being cut off, isolated in the sense of being complete. The outside world had not yet found sufficient reason to transform it. In 1973, a group of high school students in Lebanon, Missouri, started running around the Ozarks with tape recorders. Their English teacher had given them an assignment to document traditional Ozark culture. The students took it seriously. Over the next 10 years, working under what became known as the Bittersweet Project, they conducted 476 recorded interviews, published 482 stories, and took more than 50,000 photographs of Ozarks people, crafts, practices, and ways of life, which they, even as teenagers in the early 1970s, saw were disappearing fast. They were right. The interstate highway system had reached the Ozarks by then. Television had arrived. The federal government's Ozarks Regional Commission had been funding modernization projects through the 1960s, including roads, infrastructure, and the deliberate integration of the Ozarks into the national economy. Branson was beginning its transformation from a small fishing town on a warm lake into an entertainment destination. Retirees from the upper Midwest were discovering that Ozarks land was cheap, the climate was mild, and the scenery was beautiful. The Lebanon students with their tape recorders knew that the people they were interviewing, the old-timers who knew how to make lye soap, who knew where the ginseng grew, who remembered the names of the families that had lived in every hollow for 100 years before the roads came, were the last generation who would carry that knowledge. That is why they were running around with tape recorders at 17, because they could already see what was leaving. What the buyers who arrived in the 2010s and the 20s found was not the Ozarks of the sheriff on horseback, or the float trip guides, or the ginseng foragers. That Ozarks had been transforming since 1931, and the transformation had accelerated through every decade since. What they found was a place partially modernized, partially commodified, partially absorbed into the tourism economy. And still, underneath all of that, something the outside world had always found valuable without quite being able to name it. Water, land. The specific quality of isolation and natural abundance that made the Ozarks hospitable to the people who knew how to live inside it. The investment funds that arrived to buy timber rights, farmland, and water-adjacent acreage did not arrive because they loved the Ozarks. They arrived because the Ozarks had something their financial models said was going to be worth more in the future than it was in the present. It was the same calculation that brought the Kansas City businessmen in 1929 with their hydroelectric power schemes and their land trade proposals. It was the same calculation that sent the timber companies in after the Civil War to strip the Ozarks forests before any regulation existed to stop them. The calculation has always been the same. The Ozarks has something. Someone outside it wants that something. The people inside it are in the way. The difference now is speed. The dam took 2 years to build and required 20,000 workers. The modern land acquisition is quieter and faster. It is a limited liability company registered in Delaware, a cash offer delivered by letter, a recorded deed that tells you the name of the entity but not the people behind it. What the Ozarks looked like before the buyers arrived, the specific version of it that was still intact in the 1930s, partially intact in the 1960s, and documented by teenagers with tape recorders in the 1970s, cannot be recovered. The springs are the springs, the rivers are the rivers. The geology is unchanged. But those communities, that knowledge, that specific human relationship to the land which sustained people through generations without requiring anything from outside, are gone. In a way, an investment fund buying a timber lease cannot make worse, because they are already as gone as they are going to get. What can still be decided is what happens next, whether the Ozarks becomes a managed asset for people who have never walked it, or whether it remains a place where people live, not because the economics are favorable, but because the hills are theirs and they know how to be here. The buyers are betting on the former. The people who grew up here are the only ones who can decide if that bet is right. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell. Drop a comment. What do you remember about the Ozarks that is already gone? The tape recorders are still running. Everything gets recorded eventually. Thank you for watching. The truth doesn't shout. It waits for you to look closer.